Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Squared Up Coffee Break webinar. This month, we're talking about taking a deep dive into the matrix tile. My name is Matthew Long, and I'm joined this month by Dave Clarke.
Hi there, everyone. How's it going?
Dave is one of our lead developers, mostly focused around sort of design and UX and things. So if you think Squared Up looks really pretty, that's his work. And if you think it looks like a bit of a dog, well, he'll fight you for it. So I'm going to dive straight in because we've got a really packed session. And for those of you who think, man, the coffee breaks just aren't as technical as they used to be, well, there's Jason editing in this one, so you know it's going to get hardcore. Okay, let's jump in. So this month we're looking at a deep dive into the matrix tile and row perspectives. That sort of secret sauce that's always powered the matrix tile and the dynamic table tile from V3 before it. So if you ever wondered how that works or how you could customize it yourself, well, we're finally going to lift the lid and show you. So we're going to look at some of the matrix tile advanced features, some of the stuff that you can sort of do that makes it really sort of powerful in terms of customizing the layouts. We're going to look at the cell tile JSON configuration in depth. So previously on the V4 release webinar and also on last week's V4 training webinar, we sort of always looked at a cursory high glance at this sort of stuff, like pasted it in and never really gone through it. But now we're actually going to step through this stuff and tell you exactly what everything does. And then finally, we're going to look at row perspectives and how you can customize this, most importantly, so that you can have this stuff show up in the matrix tile by default, but also within VADA. So if you've ever gone to Analyse mode and wondered if you can change all the stuff that shows up there, well, you will be able to after this webinar. Okay, so that said, I want to do a quick overview of the matrix tile itself. This webinar is a follow-on from last week, so if you're watching the recording this on YouTube right now and you didn't watch our Building Enterprise Application Monitoring Dashboards webinar, I highly recommend you go back and watch that first, because there's going to be some stuff here that kind of assumes you've watched that. So the matrix tile essentially allows you to create a grid of data from either pre-configured or customized columns automatically scoped by the tile. So when you configure the tile, you give it a scope like this particular group or this class in SCOM, and then it automatically go, bam, here you go, here's a list of columns of data. It's really rich. It gives you lots and lots and lots of insights straight in one tile because it can show you lots of different types of thing. And as I said there, either it's pre-configured or you can hit an option in the UI to go and edit it and customize it yourself. So it's really, really flexible.
And I guess if you're not really sure what the matrix tile is, it's really a replacement for the V2 KPI plugin, as well as the V3 dynamic table. So really an upgrade on all fronts there. So lots of new options and lots of new visualizations as well with V4.
Yeah, we've kind of been iterating on this for a while now, and this is our sort of latest go at this.
Yeah.
Now, it features a lot of different visualization types. As Dave mentioned there, we've been working on this for a while now. So we've got your standard sort of status history sort of stuff. We've got state history, which is a new sort of visualization we can do now. So what's this object's health been like over the past sort of X hours or days? We can show your standard performance, spark lines and bars, SLAs, and lots of the different new ones as well. So we'll go over those a little bit later on. It's very flexible is the key takeaway there. And it can be configured for a high impact wall dashboard display as well. So there's a sort of large mode which kind of removes all the padding and makes everything really big and audacious. So it's great for putting on the wall somewhere in your NOC, and then everyone can sort of see at a glance just loads of monitoring information without you having to be really fiddly and lay all these different things out.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one of my favorite features. It's quite a lot of time sort of spent making it look good on a sort of a wall monitor. So if you've got sort of monitors around your office and sort of squared up on those, definitely worth sort of taking a look at that mode for those as well.
Yep. And it has these sort of pre-configured templates, which are called row perspectives. And they're the ones that are also used in VADA's Analyse mode. So if you do configure those templates, you get a consistent look between those two different features, and you know that however it's going to be displayed when this object comes up, you'll get a consistent experience there as well. It's very, very powerful. Now, that's the sort of marketing slide. Under the covers, how it works is you can configure when you create the matrix tile, you configure it to either show dynamic or custom columns. Dynamic is the sort of dynamic table mode effectively, where it just says, here's the pre-configured list out of the box that your dashboard packs have brought in. Which one do you want to display? Custom is where you then get to go and fiddle the JSON and create your own columns yourself.
Yeah, just to expand on that a little, I guess, so that the dynamic mode really sort of looks at what the objects are. So if they're IIS computers or they're SQL computers, and chooses a row perspective based on that. It looks like I've jumped ahead there. I'll let Matthew continue.
So yeah, as Dave was saying, it sort of looks at the scope of your tile. So if your tile is this group of 7 machines, we'll look at all perspectives that match those 7 computers based on the classes that could be on them, or its group membership or whatever else, and then we'll give you that list. And then what happens is there's a rank number, and that specifies basically the list they're ordered. So we'll come into this in a second with looking at row perspective later on, but suffice to say that basically that is the order that they're displayed in the matrix tile, but for VADA, the one with the highest rank is the one that's chosen automatically.
Yeah.
The custom mode, if you flip to that, uses a JSON editor in product to allow you to edit the visible columns. And basically what you're changing there is the cell tile definitions. So every column, you specify what should appear in that column, and they will automatically take every object in the context, the scope of the tile, and then repeat that column list for all objects available in that scope. So you basically define, here's a group that contains 30 objects. Here's the template for how I want to lay the data out, and then we'll just replay those columns onto every single object in that group.
Yeah, so what you're really doing there, I guess, is sort of defining a row perspective on the fly, so you can pick and choose sort of exactly what columns. You're not stuck sort of with one of the fixed definitions, but it lets you just sort of pick and choose, show exactly what you want. And then I think Matthew will sort of cover off how you then save those back as row perspectives later on.
Yep, and the neat thing about it as well is that when you click custom mode, by default it uses the columns from the dynamic perspective that you selected. So if you look at our, say, SQL one and you're like, you know what, I really don't like that one column and I wish it's something different, you can click custom mode, it'll clone that configuration in there, you can fiddle and change that one column, and then all the rest of it's done for you. So it's very, very simple to make minor tweaks, which is, we heard that feedback with V4. A lot of people wanted to just change one column and they were happy with the rest.
Yeah.
Well, now it's super easy to do that. Now, one quick sort of point and recommendation I'm going to make to you here is for every column that you define, data is then queried from squared up in batch. And then what happens is we sort that and display it in the appropriate row. So for example, if you say you want one row to be a CPU performance metric, we query CPU metrics in one go for all of the servers in the scope of this tile. And then squared up knows how to appropriately assign the values from each metric it got back into the appropriate row. Now, what that means is this has a direct impact on how long it takes the matrix tile to load. If you have 2 columns, it's really fast to load because it's making 2 backend calls. If you have 9 columns that contain 30 days of performance data, it's going to make 9 queries to the squared up backend to get that information. So just be aware that the more columns you put in, the more sort of awesome your dashboard is, but if it's a large scope, it might take a long time to load now. So there is a performance trade-off that you have to be aware of. And we've tried to make it as fast as possible. As you know, squared up is definitely a performance optimized product, but ultimately there's only so much you can do. If you ask for 19 columns on a 400 servers, it's going to take a while. Okay, that's enough waffling from me. Let's actually get into it with our first demo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the standard sort of server metrics, the Windows Server matrix tile, and I'm going to modify that to create a sort of 7-day summary view. So the idea here is to create a dashboard you can go to get a look and see across the past week what have the servers in a particular group been doing. So kind of tricky to do if you try to line all these tiles up and the sort one might not be the same and things might move around. Actually quite easy in the matrix tile. So just to, let me just refresh that. I've been logged out. So to start off with, what I've done is I created a new dashboard called the sales domain last week and created a matrix tile. Let me just open up the configuration for that. This configuration you're seeing right here is the default one. So I've just put in a class, given it some criteria to filter down just the servers I want. And now in the columns list, what you're seeing is the dynamic mode, so the default mode, and it's in auto mode right now, which is saying, select for me the highest rank, the most specific row perspective available, which is the Windows Server 2016 overview row. And this is what you get out of the box. If you do this in your squared up right now, this is what it would look like.
Yeah, I guess it's worth noting there, we ship with a few different row perspectives out of the box. So there's ones for, I think, IIS, SQL, and then different editions of Windows Server there as well.
Yep. So now this is great, but it doesn't give me an overview really of the environment. I've got this CPU's number column, which is not useful in this context. So what we can do is make some changes here, remove some columns, and move things around a bit to make it a bit better. So first thing I'm going to do is flip to custom mode. Now what this is going to do is give me the JSON configuration for the existing dashboard. Now, although I'm going to go through this, I want to just point out that this is fully documented on our support site. So if you go to our docs, search for matrix tile, the first article you get back will be this one, and it goes through every single cell tile, how you can configure them, samples, and what all the settings mean. So, if at the end of this you think, man, I'm still lost, I have no idea what I'm doing, or like, oh, I wonder if there's any extra options for this one tile, can it do X, Y, Z? Please go and read the documentation for this one. This is definitely one that you have to read rather than just sort of diving straight in and playing around with it, unless you just, telepathic or Richard Benwell. So back to my dashboard. What I'm going to do is, while I could edit it right here inside the editor, it's not a necessarily rich experience because code editing in the browser isn't necessarily that fun. So I'm going to jump to Visual Studio Code. I'm going to create a new document, paste that in, and just change this to JSON file. There we go. So Visual Studio Code is a great text editor. There's loads out there. Use your own preference one. But code is quite nice, just syntax highlighting and things like that. So what I've got here is I've got an array of JSON data. And if you're brand new to JSON editing, I should say, we do actually have a video on the coffee breaks previously on dashboard authoring using JSON. So that Richard gives a good introduction on that in that video. So go back and watch it if you're not particularly au fait with editing JSON by hand. But we have here an array, basically. The array is objects, and every object is a column in the tile. They're ordered by the order they appear. So the first column we have here is of type cell tile status. It's our status information tile, and it has a title, and the title is just the title that appears at the top of the row listing. So all of the every single server that matches my criteria will have this column, and so on and so forth. Now the top one's the status tile. Perfectly happy with that. Want to show the name of my server and the state information for it. The next one down is a cell tile text tile, which is showing off a property from the machine. In this case, it's IP address, because sometimes you need that to be able to connect to the thing, or just sort of get some insights into what's going on with an alert that's not particularly descriptive. What it's using here is it's got its configuration. There's actually some overriding configuration set for this tile. It's defining its display settings and saying that its content template, i.e. what it renders, should be this moustache. Now again, if you're new to sort of Squared Up, moustache might not make sense, but if you've been using it for a while, you know that custom labeling, our feature we have, enables you to specify this moustache to exactly control sort of what the label should be in a status block tile. This is exactly the same. So this moustache specifies that the IP address property of this object should be split using a comma, and then we should select the first result. Basically what it's doing here is it's saying if this machine has 14 IP addresses, we don't really want all of them showing up in the list. That would look quite bulky. Just always select the first one. So you're free to do any sort of manipulation that you like here in this custom cell text tile. It's quite flexible.
Yeah, and obviously all the traditional SCOM properties available there, as well as any you've added with management packs, whether that's sort of asset information or other specifics. You can pull those out there and sort of manipulate them as you wish as well.
Yep, so I know there's some customers who will definitely really make heavy use of that. The next tile down is our signal strength tile, which should have processors. That's a tile I didn't want, a column in once, sorry. I'm just going to delete that, so that's no longer in the list. And then I add my a spark line. So this is my CPU spark line here. The source is showing our metric that we want to collect. So in the config block, the source is always the data you want to query for, and the display settings is then how to display it. So in this case, I want to get the processor information object and the percentage processor time counter. And I also want to display that using a custom label. The reason I need this is because the default labels sometimes are a little bit obscure in Squared Up. We guess that something's a percentage, for example, but if the metric's been collected as like 6.43291899214, that doesn't look great on a dashboard. So we're just using a little bit of JavaScript here to say round that value up, and if the metric isn't being collected for some reason, then just show 0 instead.
Yeah, that's great. And obviously you can completely customize that. So if the metric's being recorded in bytes, but you want to show megabytes or gigabytes, then obviously you can just do sort of the division there, divide it by 1024, and then remove the percentage sign that we've got there as well, and add your own unit. So that's pretty flexible there, we think.
Yep. So so what I want to do now is I'm happy with those two columns, but what I want to do, first thing, is I want to show some history. So I'm going to add a new column, and this is copied and pasted from the docs for our health state history. So title of the column is health state history. The type is time series blocks, and what this will show is the last n days or n hours as blocks, with it being green if it was healthy for the entire time, yellow if it was warning for some of that time, or red if it went red at all in that time period. So a great way of visually understanding immediately, has the thing been healthy for the last 7 days in a row, or is it only just gone healthy? The monitor ID's configuration property is a GUID of the monitor from the object that you want to calculate health state history from. That GUID there is the one you use in 99% of cases, because that is the GUID for the top level entity health rollup that you have on every object. That's the one straight from our docs as well. There's no good reason not to use that rollup ID, but you can go and put whatever GUID you like in there. And again, the docs, if you ever look at them, specify how to go and get other GUIDs, use PowerShell, or there's some tricks in Squared Up to get that too. So again, go ahead and check that out. The other thing I've done here is I've added a time frame. And what that means is basically by default, all the cell tiles will respect the page time frame. But the page time frame for dashboards in Squared Up is 12 hours by default. And this is the last 7 days dashboard. So asking users to always click on the dashboard and then go change the scope to 7 days is a bit annoying. So the idea is I'm going to hard code it and specify in the dashboard directly that it should be last 7 days. That's what that does. Then I wanted to do is the same thing for my CPU graph. So my CPU currently is going to show the last 12 hours, because that's what the default is. So I want to force it now to use hourly data rather than the raw data, so it's a bit faster. And I also want to force it to use the last 7 days. Now, I'm going to paste a bit of JSON in here. Where I got this from is the the tiles. So all the cell tiles basically mimic normal tiles in Squared Up. So if you go and configure a tile in Squared Up, like the performance sparkline tile, and pick aggregation, hourly, time frame, last 7 days, that kind of stuff, click on the little JSON button to configure, to see the JSON behind the tile, and you can just copy the properties straight out and into our tiles in most cases. So if I grab that now.
Yeah, so I guess that's true for quite a number of the tiles, whether that's sort of the status tile we're trying to show, or the sparkline, or any of the performance ones. Really, the sort of the schema, I guess, is the same there. So, like Matthew says, whether that's the time frame or the aggregate, whatever it is, those sort of match up across the cell tiles and the traditional tiles, I guess.
Yep. So the time frame of the house history is exactly the same here, last 7 days. And we've told it to use hourly data and to use the average aggregate as well. So this should load nice and fast. We could use raw here, that would work fine, but obviously it's going to be slower than if there's lots and lots of objects in here because we're returning more data points. And I'm going to copy and paste the exact same thing into my CPU one as well. So once you get familiar with this stuff, it actually is really easy to kind of modify these things and keep going. The last change I want to make is I want to include one extra column. I want to include disk usage as well, because maybe in my environment, my teams aren't so hot at watching disk space and logs keep filling things up, and it's good to spot those sort of trending issues before they actually happen. So here's a new sparkline. It's config. It's the same sort of display label template. It's the sort of standard. This is the one we use actually in most cases if you look at our row perspectives that we configured out the box.
Yeah.
And again, last 7 days showing the C drive logical disk free space CPU. If I didn't put C colon in there, what would happen is it's going to basically pick the first disk to come back. So sometimes the graph would contain C, sometimes it could contain P, which is probably or like D or F or whatever. So be aware of that one for performance graphs. We can't show in the same column multiple metrics at the same time, so you need to be specific if there's multiple instance space available, which is what I've done here. Okay, so now I'm just going to copy the whole thing, and this is where we find out if I've got typos or not. Okay, Dave. Drum roll.
Looks good to me.
Bosh. There we go. So now you can see I've gone and made these changes. So the signal strength column disappeared for the CPU. I now have free disk space showing as well. And you can see, look, this server right now is healthy, but it's had some downtime in the past day as well. Now, I'm sure you'd agree, Dave, this dashboard doesn't look great. I know you're very picky when it comes to a sort of usability and things.
I don't know what you mean.
Yeah, right. So there's some problems here. Like the first one is this IP address column is massive, much larger than the actual data value we have. And secondly, the state column here is cutting off part of the domain name. Now these are all in the same domain, so not that important really. But if that was actually meaningful because you had lots of different domains in your forest, you'd want to be able to see that information, especially on a wall screen where you can't hover over and get the value specified. So what I can actually do is I can modify this a bit further to actually include some extra detail. So I'm going to go back to my code editor, jump to the top. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make my cell tile status bigger. So my state column has the rest of the name shown. And I also want to make the IP address column smaller so that it's not consuming so much space. So while I paste that in, Dave is going to explain what I'm going to do now.
Yeah, exactly. So I think to start with, sort of each column has a equal width, basically. So it's sort of equally shared across the screen. But Matthew's going to put in some custom configuration there. So again, this is all documented on our knowledge base. But you can define the width of each cell or column as a percentage. So this one he's set to 25% there, so that will take up 25% of the screen. And then I think this next one, he's going to add a pixel-based value.
If I don't munge up the moustache first, that is.
I'll let him fix all that. But for this one, I think he's going to set a pixel value. Obviously, the IP address is a fairly fixed length, and we know roughly sort of what that translates to in terms of screen size, I guess.
Yeah.
But for the most part, you probably want to stick with percentage values, so it sort of scales across your laptop, a wall monitor, whatever sort of screens you're showing it on there. Mm-hmm. So that's usually the best choice. But for an IP address, I don't think there's any harm in choosing a pixel value there either.
Yeah, we had an argument about this off camera. That's the reason why we're discussing this one. So now that's immediately made a big difference, right? So now the first column is getting a huge percentage, and the rest of it's now fighting for space, essentially. So like we've got a bit more of a visible dashboard.
That's starting to look better.
But there's still this huge space here. Now I could reduce the size of this column again further if I wanted to. But if this health state history is like 7 days, fine, it's quite visible. But you don't want a narrow slice for this thing if it's showing like 30 days or something like that. So the other option we have available to us, and actually I've got a slide that explains this, so let me jump back and just cover that. So we've done the cell width. So yeah, as Dave was saying, it available on every column. This will assign the width by percentage of all pixels, and then everything else basically gets the remaining space equally divided. The other option you have is full width. Now, some of the tiles, not all of them, but some of the cell tiles support the full width option. And that lets you basically say that I want the content of this column to consume the entire size of this column. So there's no padding, there's no sort of white space between columns. It can, on a really busy dashboard, reduce visibility. That's why it's not, or readability. That's why it's not on by default. But for certain columns, like the health state history column, it looks perfectly fine. So I'd probably recommend you turn it on in those cases. So I'm going to go and do that now in here. So if I go and find the health state history in its display, I'm just going to add.
And again, I think on the customer KB, there's all the details of sort of which tiles support the full width and which ones don't. But like Matthew was saying, for the sort of the block style visualizations, it really works quite well, especially in that sort of large display mode as well.
So if I hit apply changes on screen, you should see, oh, come on. Don't quite know what's happening today. I obviously haven't prayed to the demo gods enough. That is definitely very annoying. So I paste that in, hit apply changes. There we go. So you saw that
looking good.
The column now expands to fill the entire available width. And I put it in large display mode as well, so it's very visible on a wall dashboard. It's kind of made all the font nice and big, and again, removed some of the white space padding a little bit. So there we go. Now I have my sort of 7 days overview dashboard. So I've got information I need to connect to this box, identity of it, what its current health state is. I've also got trending metrics, and I've also got the health state visibility over the last 7 days. You could create a dashboard that had all these on as individual tiles, but it'd be quite hard to immediately get that sort of picture and correlate them all together. Because if you had health state on the left and then CPU here and memory here, but if they're long lists, they wouldn't sort of line up properly and that kind of thing. And if you didn't set the sort options properly, they're not going to align. So this server's over here, but the metrics up here instead, that kind of stuff. So this is really, really powerful. I can now save this dashboard off, and bam, I've created a dashboard that actually is sort of packed with information and really, really visible. Now, I mentioned there's loads of different tiles. So this is an overview. I'm not going to read all of these tiles and what they do out. So if you're watching this on YouTube, hit the pause button right now and peruse at your leisure. But I've grouped them together. So the sort of first four, the status block, monitor, and monitor block tiles, basically show current health state information, either of the whole object or of a particular monitor on that object. So you may have seen these in use on our enterprise application dashboards, like the status and availability report. So we show out there like the health of the dependencies, the map, and the availability tests all as separate objects. That's using the monitor tile. The next two are sort of historical reporting tiles. So that's the health state history and the SLA tile. So they're great for your boss, who wants to see, like, over time, are we improving? Are we meeting our SLAs? Has my app actually been up more often than it's been down? That kind of stuff. And then we have the performance sort of options, so the spark lines and bars. Bear in mind with the bar option, it is really designed to be used with a percentage value. The bar is drawn from 0 to 100%. So ideally, it works great for like CPU usage. Doesn't work so great for like available memory, because that's going to be a huge value and the bar's not going to really make any sense. It'll just be full for almost every single system because they usually have more than 100 meg of available memory. And the last two are the custom text and signal strength ones. They extract data from the properties of an object. So like we saw before, pull out the IP address or the Active Directory site or any other field, or maybe if you've gone and extended your CMDB and SCOM with like owner fields and asset tags and that kind of thing, you can pull them out here. But usage will vary basically depending on what object you're looking at and what its available properties are. So for some, they'll be killer. For others, you won't use them. It's really up to you. Okay, so that's the cell tiles. So maybe watching this and thinking, okay, this is cool. I can now go and build these things, but I'm going to have to go and do this over and over and over again for all my dashboards. And more importantly, if I do configure a good looking matrix tile for a particular group, if another group of users over here who, are creating their own dashboards goes and adds that, they've got to replicate exactly the same thing. And also, how do I keep them all in sync if I want to make changes? Now, the answer to that question basically is row perspectives. That's the template that's underneath the matrix tile. It's what it automatically selects in that dynamic view when it shows you, here's the different visualizations I could use. Now, this is the first time we've actually talked about publicly how to do this stuff. So this is definitely a sort of world first for SquaredUp. If my PowerPoint's going to behave itself. Hey. So, you've heard about us talk about perspectives before. So SquaredUp makes heavy use of perspectives anyway to display sensible information in a given context. So you go to a SQL server, we're going to show you a SQL server view. You go to an IIS web server, we're going to show you a web server view. So you're maybe quite familiar already with perspectives in terms of the perspective ribbon. Well, row perspectives are basically exactly the same, They are still stored in dashboard packs. And like Dave mentioned, we ship with a whole bunch of them already in the box. They have a match criteria that basically lets you define which class or group or object they apply to. So if you've ever created a perspective in Squared Up before, you know the first thing it asks you is, what should I apply to, this object or this class or this group or both?
I think typically you're probably going to use the sort of the class and the group there the most. Also, you probably want to define sort of a template, a perspective that's shown, say, for every SQL server or every IIS computer, whatever it is. But occasionally you might use the sort of particular object as well. Maybe it's a row perspective for a particular application and you want to show some key metrics there, whatever that is, and whatever makes sense, really.
So, yeah, and you can be more specific about that because they also have a rank value. So the rank value determines if more than one perspectives match, the order they should list in the inside the matrix tile, but in the case of VADA, which one should I display and win out? So what you could do, and this is the really sort of advanced use case here, is create a whole bunch of perspectives that match, say, all my classes. So every generic like Exchange server gets this view, or maybe Exchange is a bad example, like every IIS server gets this particular view, but actually for these servers in our production environment, they get an extra column being added because they're in this group. And then these servers over here, this particular one server that's part of this app, it gets a very bespoke perspective that the team have specifically asked for. And because that has the highest rank, that's the one that displays first for that context. But if it's not one of those servers, then it will fall back to one of the others. So you can get very clever here and give all these different teams different visualizations depending on their needs. So it's very flexible.
That's it, exactly. So the ranks start from 0. So if you've got something sort of reasonably generic, you obviously can give that a low rank. So maybe 0 to 100 are your sort of generic perspectives. And then you go from there, sort of the more specific, the higher the rank, basically.
Yep. So one recommendation would be if you're going to override, as it were, our default row perspectives, don't actually modify ours because then you can't necessarily receive updates from us, as it were, when we update our packs. Just create yours with a higher rank than ours, and then they'll always show up first. But you've always got ours to fall back to or rely on if you want to. Okay, the main difference between the two of them basically is that dashboard perspectives contain the layout of the dashboard. So they'll have like, I want to have 5 columns and a list in this first column, and then I want to have in this column over here a single part, and then this one's 50% width and that kind of stuff. They instead just define what they should match on, and then that same columns cell tile layout that you saw before in the matrix tile, they just define that again.
Yeah, so it's just a simple list basically. So there's no sort of columns or any particular layouts in there, just purely an array. So you'll see that shortly as well.
So now we're going to go into demo. So I'm actually going to create a row perspective for an F5 load balancer. So if you have the F5 management pack from Haiku, you know they have a dashboard pack available as well. But currently it doesn't have any row perspectives in it for the F5. So I'm going to show you how to go and configure one of those should you want to. Now, just as a note, I'm not releasing this publicly. This is just a sort of stab in the dark at this. I'll leave this to guys who actually are managing load balancers to say what kind of metrics and things they'd want to see. But this is probably a pretty good example, and I'm fairly sure you could apply the concepts here to your load balancer of choice. So if you haven't got an F5, but you have a Netscaler or a Kemp or whatever, well, you can still probably apply this to that particular thing as well. Okay, so I'm going to go back to Visual Studio Code, and in my continuing Blue Peter theme, here is one I made earlier. So I'm going to hide this columns section for a minute, and I might actually just zoom in a bit as well, because that's a little bit hard to see probably on the webinar. So what we basically have is this sort of top block here is the row perspective specific stuff. And then the bottom half of it, which I've hidden, is the columns listing. So we'll focus on the top bit. So the first thing you have to add is a comment. So the comment is just a description for you. It doesn't display and Squared Up anywhere of what this perspective actually is. And that's kind of handy because a lot of perspectives wind up with the same or very similar names. Like you'd be surprised how many dashboards in customer environments are just called overview. So this comment can be helpful sometimes for you to distinguish what am I actually looking at here. So I've called it the F5 virtual server custom perspective. And then you have the ID. This ID is what we use in Squared Up to match on this perspective and also to locate it and index it and things like that. It's a GUID and it has to be unique across the entirety of Squared Up. So don't just copy one of these from a previous dashboard. Don't just take one of the number on the end and change that to a 3. Actually generate a brand new GUID. Easy way to do that is in PowerShell. There's a one-liner you can use to generate a new GUID. I think we've shown that before. But there's also web tools to go and generate a new GUID as well. So definitely go and do that. Do not just copy and paste these things or reuse them. And the magic piece you have to use here is this format row. This is what tells Squared Up that this is not a normal perspective, but this is a row perspective instead. Because otherwise they look incredibly similar. So this is a really key piece. Don't miss that out. And then the next piece is this match block. And that is, as we said, the object or the group in SCOM that this row perspective applies to. Now, where I generated this from is by just going and creating a brand new perspective on my F5 load balancer. And then once I'd picked my scope for it, in my perspective settings, I just hit the dashboard JSON button in the top right, and then that JSON block is lifted directly from there. So, pretty easy to do it. But that's just a class ID, basically. The class ID of the SCOM object that it applies to, or it would be group IDs and be the group, or you can even do it with both or enable a specific object if you wanted to too. And then the last sort of thing is the name and the rank. So the name is what it should appear by in the UI. So in the matrix tile, that's the list, in that list of available perspectives, that's the one it shows up with. And then the rank is the priority ordering. As Dave mentioned, 0 is the lowest rank, and then 9 billion or whatever is the highest potential value. So it's sensible for you to always pick numbers are quite far apart, because if you do 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, you can easily in the future insert a new one in between those. If you do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you've got to go and reorder all your existing row perspectives if you want to slot a new one in somewhere else. So pick reasonably high range numbers, and as Dave was saying, like have a standard in your organization and say, well, look, squared ups ones are all, let's say, less than 500, so we'll always go above that. And then ours will be 500 to 1,000 is a generic perspective that applies to anything, or like any instance of that particular text, so any Exchange server or any SQL server or any load balancer. Maybe for a particular group one, we then go with like 2,000, and then 3,000 is this specific server. It only applies to this app. That's a specific way of doing it.
I think that'll just save you a few headaches later on when you need to go through and, like Matthew said, sort of insert a particular perspective somewhere. There's large gaps. I mean, you can just drop that in with ease.
Yep, and should easily guarantee as well there's not going to be a clash, and that the most specific perspective always applies. There's nothing in squared up to like automatically order that. Like it's not like in some other places inside SCOM, if this perspective matches this entire class, it's like an override, sorry, where this perspective matches this entire class, this perspective matches this class, but only things inside that group. We don't have anything there to control which one appears, because the one is more specific than the other. We just use the rank. And then the columns, the last piece is just the columns we previously shown you. So my sort of top tip, another top tip for you is before you set out to create a row perspective, go and create a matrix tile exactly the way you want it, get all the columns working properly, and once you're happy with it, then come and create a row perspective, and you can just paste that columns configuration in. So for this one, for the F5, we've got a status column, because again, I want to show the state of this virtual server. The next one down is an address column, which is another text column, which shows the IP address of the virtual server and its port. So I can now immediately see, okay, we're load balancing this network name on this IP address and this port number. So that's the one I should try and connect to, or all clients should be configured to hit. The third one is a connections spark line. So showing, this is all metrics from the F5 management pack. So the current client-side connections, and then from the virtual server. And I've also put a label template in to say, if there's no value, then just so a dash. A bit nicer than showing nothing. And the final two are the inbound and outbound traffic. I won't show the other one because it's exactly the same as this one, just outbound rather than inbound. Now, the really key point here, I'm going to stop for a while and explain this, is you'll notice we have this big transforms section in the middle. This is documented, but I want to call this out because we've already had some customers sort of struggling with this, and this is applied to the matrix tile too. As I mentioned, the way that it works in VADA is that we query for all of the data for a column in one single call. Makes it very performant. SquareUp doesn't then slow to a halt while it tries and creates this data. But that means we have to know how to correlate data that comes back from that call to each individual row. If you target your matrix tile at a top level object, like a computer or an SMP device, it already comes pre-sorted via that top level key, and it's easy for us to work out, okay, well, this is how we order this data. If it's not a top level entity, so it's a disk, for example, or in the case of this, it's a virtual server hosted on the load balancer itself, you will need to tell the matrix tile or the row perspective how to group that data. Now, the fortunate thing for you guys is that this transform works by using the path, basically, and it works in everything in SCOM. So you don't ever need to change this, and it's on the documentation everywhere. Just paste this in anytime you use a spark line on something that isn't a top level entity. Don't worry about what this does, just paste it in there and it works. So if you ever look at my next column, it's also a spark line. It has exactly the same thing in, but basically what this is doing is just saying, group it by the managed entity object, and this is how you transform the data to get the appropriate ID so you can tell which set of data belongs to which row. It's basically what it's doing. And then, like Dave mentioned earlier, I've got a bit more fancy of a row perspective in here because this data comes back as megabits per second. So I'm just making this look nice. I'm putting the right unit type on there on the end. So that's my row perspective. As I said, I've already tested this as a matrix tile, so I'm happy with that, the configuration of this. what I have to do now is get this into the product. Now, this is the part where my demo falls apart. So fingers crossed, everyone. We don't have a good way in the UI right now of inserting these things. Where they all live is on disk. If you go to squared up into your root of your application, go into user, packages, everyone, perspectives, row, you'll find here are some of them. There's also a rows folder in here. So it doesn't actually matter which one you put them in, but there you go, rows. So there's all our row perspectives. So there's the Windows Server ones, there's the EAM ones, that kind of thing. If you drop it in here, this is how you get it to appear inside squared up. So moment of truth. I'm going to grab and copy this in, copy to rows. As I said, the folder name you drop it into doesn't actually matter. It's the format column row that we put in that actually is what makes it a row perspective. But just putting it in this folder structure just makes it a bit easier to figure out what it is if you're looking on disk. Now, it's on disk. It's not actually loaded into the product yet. You either need to recycle the app pool or you need to go into the system settings, go into community packs and hit reload all content. Where's it gone?
I think it's under dashboards, is it?
Dashboards? There it is. Dashboards. Thank you, Dave. We moved it. I'm used to still thinking of V3. So if I hit reload all content, that will now make squared up scan on this server and pull that disk. Now, we mentioned this in the HA V4 Getting Started webinar. There are some ramifications for doing reload all content in HA. If you're doing manual disk edits, please go back and watch that webinar or get in touch with support if you're planning on doing this with a HA setup, because there are not consequences, but things you should be aware of when making manual disk changes in squared up in a HA configuration. So get in touch or go and watch that webinar so that you're aware of what's going on here and you know how to do this properly without getting yourselves into a pickle. Okay, now that I've done that, what I should be able to do is go to a new VADA session. I know we're running out of time, guys, so I'm going to try and make this quick. I should now be able to put my F5 onto the dashboard and have it show up. So let me add a new dependency in, manual add sales underscore app underscore web underscore.
So this is one of the virtual servers, I think, for the F5 load balancer. Is that right, Matthew?
That's right. So it's not the website, it's not the load balancer itself, it's the virtual endpoint that it's defining. I pop that on there, that will appear and do its discovery. We added it in V4 so it can now discover the other nodes. Let me drop them all in here a second. I'm going to assume that you've all seen VADA before, but if I switch to Analyse mode now, hey, look at that. Great. So now I've got the out-the-box perspectives here for CPU for my O3. Tell you what, while I just talk about this, let's just make this a bit fancier and add in my other servers on the back end. So I've got my row perspectives for those. Quickly SQL, come on, SQL.
While that's loading, it's probably worth sort of keeping in mind, you maybe want to choose sort of maybe 2 to 4 sort of columns, I guess, to show in the row perspective, especially on VADA. Obviously, the more columns you add, the harder that is to be to sort of read and parse, I guess, all that information.
Yeah.
Obviously in VADA and in the matrix chart itself, you can click to drill down and then you've got all the regular perspectives and views there that sort of you'd expect. So usually picking, 1 or 2 key metrics and then maybe some sort of health state, if that's what you want to show, is a good thing, I'd say.
Yep, absolutely. Great point there. So try and keep it concise. Don't just whack everything on there. Yep. I can have 32 metrics. Please don't. So now you can see, like the load balancer is showing relevant things for the load balancer. So number of connections, inbound and outbound traffic. The IS web service is showing IS specific metrics. And the CPU is showing, what you'd expect for a SQL server as well, or not. Go and customize these at your will. But as I said, these guys are all showing the out-the-box ones. This one is now showing our custom one. So really here, the world is your oyster. Like, be as imaginative as you like. Go and configure specific row perspectives for certain apps so that when one team comes into their app, like I can go to the sales app now and see all the KPIs that are really important for our application. I don't care about like memory. Great, throw it off the perspectives. It shouldn't be there. And also I can now quickly show you this. If I go and put that virtual server on any, let's do it very fast. Going off script, but I don't care. If I go and put the F5 virtual server, there we go. It's automatically showing my custom perspective here now. As you can see, one of our load balancers isn't doing anything. That's what this dash is. The other one's got some traffic going through it. So now every time anyone in Squared Up goes and views that load balancer or any other class I could attach these to, they'll now get that consistent configuration. So that's how you make it sort of a template that you can reuse over and over again. Okay, hopefully that's been really cool for you guys, and that's been sort of a cool thing. We're running sort of to time now, but as I said, if you have sort of any questions, you look at this and think, oh God, I really want to do this, but this looks so scary. So we do have existing resources. Go and check those out. if nothing else, reach out to our support staff and they'll be more than happy to help you walk through this sort of stuff. Okay. Once you've done it a couple of times, it's actually really easy, and the payoff can be immense when you start getting into sort of more advanced cases. This isn't like a thing you do on day one of Squared Up, but this can really actually breathe some new life into some certain use cases. So it's definitely worth thinking about and starting to sort of imagine some of the use cases.
Yeah, it's definitely a great way, I think, to customize sort of Squared Up to your liking, whether that's sort of for custom management packs that you've built or maybe third-party ones. Obviously, Matthew was using the HiQ F5 pack there. So yeah, definitely, I think lots of scope for customization there, and really, yeah, just makes for a nicer experience, I think, when sort of drilling down through VADA or the matrix tile, whatever it is. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so with that, I'm going to wrap the webinar up because we've sort of hit time now. As I mentioned, if you want us to cover certain topics in the future, like this has been one of the more commonly requested ones, go to our community answers platform, so community.squareup.com. Raise questions on there, maybe on topics on this webinar or on other things on Squared Up or enterprise monitoring in general. We monitor those questions and help, but more importantly, our community does, because we build a monitoring dashboard product. You guys are the ones who actually run this thing in production live. So, your peers have much better insight than we could on the best way to, visualize enterprise applications and things like that. So definitely go and check out answers there. If you get stuck with this sort of stuff, post it on community answers, and one of our amazing community will get back to you with an answer pretty much immediately, usually. So they're a really great bunch. Definitely go and check that out. You can sign up for future coffee breaks. If you thought this was really cool, this is your first time seeing it, or you're watching this on YouTube, head to squareup.com/coffee-break-series, where you can fill in your details, and then we'll email you the schedule, and you can sign up and be part of this and be on the live recordings and ask us questions and get feedback and things like that directly. So we really value your contributions and participation. So definitely go and have a look at that if you're interested. The recordings and slides from this webinar we publish on our blog, along with a wealth of other great content. So if you really like what you've seen here and you're new to Squared Up or monitoring or SCOM or anything else, go and check out our blog. We have a huge amount of coffee breaks now available on our YouTube playlist. I mentioned before we've got like stuff on perspectives on there, on configuring EAs and building dashboards. We've got things on there for editing JSON and making Squared Up advanced customizations and templating. We've covered a lot of stuff by now, so it's a really good resource there to go and check that stuff out if you haven't seen it before. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn us over to Q&A now. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the questions box, and me and Dave, along with our engineering team, will attempt to answer them now on the recording. If you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to place a comment in the video description below, or reach out to our support team, and they'll be happy to answer your questions. If not, thank you very much for your time this afternoon, guys. Thank you, Dave, for joining me.
No worries. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
And talk to you next month, guys.